It is Friday, October the 23rd, 2020. This is the Distant Peasant Podcast, and I am your host, Jeff in Georgia. On today's show, party like it's 1898, the Insurrection at Wilmington. Yeah, I've been looking a lot for a historical event that might tell us on the left something about politics in America in this very particular moment, just days before the 2020 election. About race, politics, and what it means to be racist or not, to organize your politics around that or not, what it looks like in practice. But before I get to all of that, just a brief reminder that today's show, like all of these shows, is brought to you by listeners like you, human beings who have gone to patreon.com/distantpeasant. They become recurring donors for as little as $1 a month. They have access to a Discord where they can talk to me anytime. I'm pretty much always there. I read everything because not that much happens in there. If you really are hardcore Jeff head, that's where the fix is. PayPal.me/distantpeasant is me. Thank you to each and every one of my supporters, without whom the show literally would not be possible. Just a reminder before I get started, one more at least. Post Revolution on twitch.tv. If you go to twitch.tv/postrevolution, you can catch me. You can catch Bra. You can catch Kentucky Fried Comrade. We share that channel, we post things, we stream things, we hang out. Play video games, chill, talk to other streamers. It's great. So be sure to check that out. Follow that channel again. That's twitch.tv/postrevolution on with the show. Where does racism in a person, racism in the modern sense, come from? Now, I'm not sure the definitive answer is known by anyone. It certainly stems, at least in part, from the related phenomenons of xenophobia and ethnocentrism, that's fear of the other and the application of one's own culture or ethnicity standards onto another's, respectively. You couple this with evolving conceptions in the West of heritage and family, quote, natural hierarchy, later genetics, and very importantly, contact and conflict with the peoples of the Americas, beginning in the late 15th century. All this led to humanity's invention of races as a classification, such as white and black. Though always thinking in these rigid categories can also be personally transcended through effort, I think. But this is broad sociological stuff, and I am not so wise in the social sciences as to be able to reliably tease out everything that makes a person's heart and what truly makes a person do or think what they do or think from one person to the next. I cannot reliably say, not even for myself. But I'll grant that there's certainly something natural, if not unconquerable and inevitable, about the tendency of people to love those like them and fear those unlike them, however defined, and to organize and then conflict over material resources based on this tendency. So, is personal racism a natural and inevitable phenomenon, given the sweep of human history? Has it grown essentially contingent upon a person's racial identity in a society, i.e. the idea that white people in America are inevitably personally racist because they exist in a society that values their whiteness, however much they might strive for transcendence? And that therefore only people of the country's marginalized racial and ethnic minorities can transcend this attitude? Or is it a matter of education? Can one be instructed not to be racist? Or perhaps socialization, the facing of verbal condemnation or social ostracism for racist words or deeds, and rewards for the opposite? It seems to me that these are the sorts of questions that are endlessly fascinating to most people who think and talk about politics on the left, broadly speaking. And it also seems to me that their answers will remain forever in doubt. For my part, I am no public psychologist or therapist. I am not engaged in thought training. I talk history and politics, And politics isn't really about, or at least isn't just about, what's in a person's heart or head, but in a person's hands. However natural the phenomenon that people organize their political demands along strictly modernly conceived racial lines, I know for absolute certain that such a state of affairs can't sustain itself under its own power, that it doesn't last forever without deliberate help, and that building a white supremacist politics requires encouragement and investment, even in the United States of America, KKK. Another way of thinking is possible, a way to find unity with one another across boundaries of race and ethnicity in politics, to make equality mean something other than discretely defined communities, each with a proportionate share of resources, but an acknowledgement, instead, that we are all one community, and that race doesn't have to separate us in politics, even in a racist country. Those who encourage this racial separation, in my opinion, either do it for their own interests as members or partisans of an ownership class, or are foolish enough to have accepted their terms, for it all gets fought out on their chosen ground, a white supremacist empire. But to put things plain for you, is the primacy of race in forming political coalitions in America a constant, like a force of human nature that must be accommodated? No. And the reason, or at least one reason, I'm certain of all that, is because of events in a city called Wilmington in North Carolina in and around 1898. Because even here, in the former Confederacy, and well after the resurgence of reactionary racist Democrats in the state's government, racism and white supremacy as a dominant political organizing principle required many helping hands to win the day. In the end, it required a violent coup. To set the stage for you, Wilmington is in the far southeast of North Carolina, and since antebellum times was majority black. Now, the Civil War is long over by 1898, of course, and so is Reconstruction. So there is no Freedmen's Bureau and no federal army at hand to enforce any civil rights. The Ku Klux Klan is waning rather than waxing after its suppression under President Grant around 1870, but new paramilitary groups wearing red shirts in South Carolina have already begun appearing, and will begin to appear in North Carolina very soon as well. Through the efforts of these red shirts to suppress, subjugate, intimidate, and murder potential and actual black voters and any whites voting Republican, Republican rule in nearby South Carolina and later in North Carolina was ended in the 1870s, with conservative Democrats incredibly hostile to African American rights beginning to regain control, first of the state legislature of North Carolina in 1870 and the governorship in 1877. This, coupled with the compromise between Hayes and Tilden and the Great Betrayal regarding the presidential election of 1876, spelled the end of federal support for the well-being and political rights of its black citizens in the South. Though their control of North Carolina would seem to be pretty thorough and complete, and thus the comparatively small port town of Wilmington easy enough to politically dominate, these conservative Democrats, organizing around white supremacy as a banner issue, faced a few key problems. Though they amended the state constitution 30 times, they appointed local officials at the state level rather than having elected ones whenever they could, they mandated segregation, banned interracial relationships, and granted the General Assembly nullification power over local laws, and much, much more, to turn North Carolina into basically a fiefdom of the governor and state legislature in the name of protecting white men. Their effective control was largely limited to the poorer western part of the state, where there were very few black people. To put it another way, their laws and proclamations and orders and whatnot were frequently ignored where they were most unpopular. A second difficulty was that these Democrats were committed to governing on behalf of the reactionary interests of capital in the area, and so with that came all the usual graft, incompetence, fraud, and, as always with economically conservative interests, a complete refusal to respond to mass economic depression and collapse in the market, or view labor as anything but a lemon to be squeezed, whatever its color. In terms of that economic depression and collapse, before there was a Great Depression, there was, well, the Great Depression. I'm not really much of an economist, but to put things basically for you, following a financial panic and a series of bank failures in 1873 related to the demonetization of silver and the overexpansion of railroads and much else, I'm sure, the United States and indeed the world entered a depression called the Great Depression before the 1930s came along. This was a global phenomenon, and I am necessarily brushing past a lot of details, but depending upon which scholar you ask, this sometimes kicks off a worldwide depression that won't truly be alleviated until 1896. So it was over this period of time, despite the resurgence of the Old South's aristocracy in politics, white political solidarity began to fracture, including in the Confederacy itself in North Carolina and around Wilmington. Many whites refused to align with a party that did not support the coinage of silver. The deflationary effects of the reimposed gold standard hit people harder the less money that they had. And they were also increasingly incensed at the state legislature and governor's refusal to do anything about the issue of rampant personal debts that people could not pay. The railroad issue hit close to home for them too, as fraud and misappropriation of funds left their state with an unfinished railroad and a mountain of debt. Raising taxes to pay for it was out of the question, of course, so the railroad was completed using convict labor. The state then sold it off and paid less than 15% to bondholders of what it had owed on the whole thing. This had all kind of started under Republican rule, of course, but Democrats' complicity in the fraud and failure to resolve the issue once they had power enraged the populace. So all this, coupled with a series of agricultural failures that exacerbated all these problems, brought things to a head in the elections of 1896 in North Carolina. Though the previous 6 governors of that state had been Democrats all, in that year, 1896, North Carolina elected its first Republican governor in a generation, and he would be the last until the 1970s. Daniel Lindsay Russell was an enormous 300 pounds, a former Confederate Army captain born to the planter class, and incredibly unusually for a man of that class, he joined the Republican Party after the Civil War. Though the new Populist Party's alliance with the Republicans broke down at the state convention that year, causing the 7th ballot nominated Russell to have to run against a separate populist slate of candidates, backed by lily white Republicans who wanted nothing to do with any black citizens, many populists ended up voting for him anyway. And combined with the votes of Republicans, mostly black in the state, Russell won the election. In the end, an estimated 87% of eligible black voters went to the polls in 1896 North Carolina, nearly all of them Russell voters. And it wasn't just the governorship either. The state senate and assembly both had massive fusionist majorities. And by 1896, every statewide office was under their control, even as another fusion candidate for president, Democrat populist William Jennings Bryan, went down to defeat. As Russell remarked, to give you a flavor of the politics of the time, quote, "The Negroes do not want control. They only demand, and they ought to have it, every right a white man has," end quote. So I want to give you a picture of what this coup that's about to happen will be interrupting. And for the record, things really start to pop off in Wilmington around Election Day, November 8th, 1898. But in the time just before that, the Fusion Coalition had already begun to make some substantial changes based on their platform. For one thing, though it was incredibly common for the populace of North Carolina to believe in their bones in the truth of white supremacy, they insisted upon the principle of one man, one vote. So at least in this, a black vote and a white one were absolute equals. And this trait, more than any other, made their election victories possible. They wanted free and public education for all, debt relief, regulation of monopoly capitalism, and an end to the rule of railroads and bankers in their state. They also wanted to democratize, and did democratize, local government to counter the Democrats' previous constitutional amendments and changes to how local officials would be selected, which led to big changes in local government and patronage. I do not want to paint a false picture of true racial equality. In Wilmington, a majority black city, only 3 or perhaps 4 out of the 10 city aldermen were black. I have seen both numbers. And nearly all white fusionists of this time and place resisted equality with non-white people to some degree. But these black voters were too important a part of their voting coalition to ever be excluded. And many black North Carolinians ran for county and local offices. They won, and they took seat during the populist sweep, which really began at a statewide level starting around 1894. So we are only a couple of election cycles into cracking white Democratic dominance in the former Confederacy. Things weren't fair, but they were certainly getting fairer. In terms of the black community specifically, in Wilmington in the run-up to the coup, things are a little muddled in the record. For example, the Raleigh News and Observer's historical report lists these details in its 2006 special on the event, quote, Wilmington's middling prosperity rested upon its black majority. Blacks owned 10 of the city's 11 eating houses and 20 of its 22 barbershops. Black entrepreneur Thomas Miller was one of Wilmington's 3 real estate agents. The city's business directory listed black-owned Bell and Pickens as one of only 4 dealers and shippers of fish and oysters. Many of Wilmington's most sought-after craftsmen were also black. Jewelers and watchmakers, tailors, mechanics, furniture makers, blacksmiths, shoemakers, stonemasons, plasterers, plumbers, wheelwrights, and brick masons. Frederick Sadguar, an African-American architect, financier, and contractor, owned a stately home that still stands as a monument to his talents and industry, end quote. Now, while some black Republicans did own property in and around Wilmington, and a very few had a substantial amount of wealth, most of the expansion in their prosperity as a people, such as it was as they moved into skilled labor that sometimes paid okay. The credit or loans that were available to them tended to be double the interest rate of whites, and lenders refused to ever accept payment from black borrowers in installments. It was principal or nothing, which conveniently left those white lenders positioned to take over black-owned property. Decades of bank failures, including of the local Freedmen's Bank branch in 1874, had made the black citizens of Wilmington and the surrounding area wary of banks in general. The share of property owned in New Hanover County by black people on the eve of the coup was perhaps 8%, though they constituted 60% of the population, and their per capita wealth was around $30, with the comparable figure for whites at around $550. Black people thus didn't tend to pay much in taxes, while white people did, which led to a strange scenario where the racist political literature of the time is upset that A, black people don't pay taxes because they can't save money and accumulate property, they're so shiftless, and B, that they also have too much money, as they and their skills came into economic competition with whites on the labor market. By 1900, the fusionist Daniel Russell will be pointing to this lack of wealth himself, as evidence they, because they were already so accustomed to, quote, hardship and privation in patient industry, end quote, that black people in North Carolina had actually substantial advantages over white laborers. A laughable perspective, of course. But in the meantime, before that, where blacks had a substantial majority and political power to defend their own interests, like in New Hanover County prior to the coup, vandalism, arson, and other violence against them was, relative to other parts of the state, less frequent than elsewhere. Furnifold Simmons was the state's newly elected Democratic Party chairman after the drubbings the party had received in 1894 and 1896, and it was his job to put a stop to all of this. The men who gave him that job were concerned with fusionist government in a few different areas, beyond the basic resentment of racist Democrats at being shut out of the patronage system. Restrictive laws on voting that they favored had been repealed. Interest rates had been capped, which also capped local white finance's ability to extract revenue from debt. Tax laws were adjusted and made more progressive, and new state regulations on railroads meant restrictions on when, how, and for how much one could cash in if they held stock in any such endeavor. You can probably imagine the sorts of men who've got the most concerns about this sort of thing and who are used to hiring others to do jobs. Big business, bankers, aristocrats, and railroad men of the area. Simmons became a conduit for these interests, promising to immediately and drastically slash taxes in exchange for immediate and hefty donations to the party. and get rid of any and all obstacles they could towards continuing that capital's increasing domination of society. But then as now, such rhetoric doesn't play well with everyone in the public. So instead, publicly, they campaigned on one issue and one issue alone: Negro domination in society. And it will pay off for Simmons personally. His efforts here will end up making him a U.S. Senator from North Carolina for 30 years. As one collaborator put it, Simmons became, quote, a genius in putting everybody to work. Men who could write, men who could speak, and men who could ride. The last by no means the least important, end quote. As for men who could write, the author of that quote is speaking of himself, for he was Josephus Daniels, the editor and publisher of the News and Observer, who himself was an important spearhead in their propaganda efforts in the press. By men who could speak, they meant men like Alfred Moore Waddell, an aging former Confederate lieutenant colonel and former congressman, then unemployed and in his 60s, and desperate to recapture some semblance of his former career's glory. He will eventually end up becoming the mayor of Wilmington, after forcing the previous occupant to resign the office at gunpoint. And he was so skilled an orator that he was called an American Robespierre. A stupid appellation, frankly, though perhaps the analogy would work if Robespierre had been a tool of the Bourbons. Waddell became particularly famous, or infamous, for virulent and graphic stories about black men's lust for white women. And when Alexander Manley, the owner of Wilmington's only black paper and himself the acknowledged child of a white former governor and a black slave, protested all this in response to a pro-lynching speech with the truth, quote, "The papers are filled often with reports of rapes of white women, and the subsequent lynching of the alleged rapist. The editors pour forth volumes of aspersions against all Negroes because of the few who may be guilty. If the papers and speakers of the other race would condemn the commission of crime because it is crime, and not try to make it appear that the Negroes were the only criminals, they would find their strongest allies in the intelligent Negroes themselves. Our experience among poor white people in the country teaches us that the women of that race are not any more particular in the matter of clandestine meetings with colored men than are the white men with colored women. Meetings of this kind go on for some time, until the woman's infatuation or the man's boldness bring attention to them, and the man is lynched for rape. Tell your men that it is no worse for a black man to be intimate with a white woman than for a white man to be intimate with a colored woman. You set yourselves down as a lot of carping hypocrites, and that you cry aloud for the virtue of your women while you seek to destroy the morality of ours. Don't think ever that your women will remain pure while you are debauching ours. You sow the seed. The harvest will come in due time." End quote. White populists also fought back against this stuff too. Now, they may have been white supremacists, but they also recognized a con when they saw one. And many of them also recognized very quickly that racial resentment was being used not just to break their coalition and subjugate their interests, but break democracy in America itself. Populist politician Oliver Dockery put it this way, quote, "Democrats will not let the Negro vote. This should prompt you colored people to stand together with the populists and your other white friends until we fasten an honest election law on the state forever." Can there be a more diabolical scheme than this latest plan of monopoly? What think ye, laborers? Are you ready to march into the trap? Are you ready to surrender your liberties? Can the hypocrite leaders be anything else except tools or fools? Are you ready to follow them, progressive farmer? When you go to town, be tempted. They set you up to dinner at the hotel, they give you a drink, they call you a good fellow, too good to be in the fusion crowns, and in 100 other ways they will tempt you to tear down and worship the Simmons Ransom gold bug machine. The Democrats in Tar Heeldom are straining their lungs and using all the big type in the printing of farce to prove that Negro domination is what is the matter in North Carolina, but it won't work. not altogether. Wherein is Negro domination responsible for the Democratic judges who have sat on the bench in recent years in a state of beastly intoxication and sentenced innocent men to the penitentiary and allowed rogues and murderers to go free? Wherein was Negro domination responsible for the lease to the Southern Railway of the North Carolina property which has been denounced as a midnight crime? Wherein is Negro domination responsible for the existence of one of the greatest trusts of the century, which has impoverished the entire state? Who has been responsible for the shameless record of theft and plunder at the state's capital when the legislature was solidly Democratic? It was because of the infamous proceedings of Democratic misrule and pillage that the Populist Party was born. From the ranks of democracy came every mother's son of the many thousands of populace who are righteous in wrath against conspirators masquerading as untrammeled democracy. That is the truth of the whole sorry business, and whenever the Democratic Party will purge itself, when it will shake off the bloodsuckers and leeches which have disfigured and disgraced it, there are thousands who will return to its folds. But until that glad day comes, the Democrats must do something else besides cry Negro domination. End quote. I got a bit carried away about men who could speak and men who could write. Coups are never won by such activities alone, and so I come finally to the men who ride, the red shirts. Now, as I briefly mentioned before, while they were a phenomenon across the South, limiting ourselves to North Carolina in and around 1898, they were a paramilitary and terrorist arm of the Democratic Party. Sometimes described as its partner, but more like its tool, I'd say. Now, unlike the Ku Klux Klan, that these men's faces were visible and their terrorist activities public was the point. But they also tended to be looked down upon by Democratic Party elites themselves, because they tended to be lower-class whites who could really use a nice payout from those elites for the work. Party leaders did their best to keep them around only when they wanted them. In the weeks before the massacre and coup, marches of red shirts would end with barbecues and free liquor and brass bands and floats topped with 22 of the most beautiful white women the organizers could find, at least once, all dressed in white, and a demonstration of their latest model Gatling gun, purchased by the city's white fathers for the then staggering sum of $1,200. A few days later, they will then kill about 300 black people and drive thousands more from Wilmington forever, changing it from a majority black city to a majority white city, a state of affairs that persists to this very day. These red shirts were unambiguous about what they wanted the black people of North Carolina and New Hanover County to do. They were not going to be allowed to vote, and neither were any race traitor whites going to be allowed to vote, and they were going to enforce this with violence. In the days leading up to the November 8th election, an atmosphere of paranoia and fear descended on Wilmington among everyone. The area's black citizens and populace and white Republicans were alarmed by these shows of force, and further alarmed when businesses refused to sell them guns and ammunition for their own defenses. Among the whites not actively involved in stoking the paranoia, there was a sense that the franchise was going to be denied to black people and their political allies, and their speculation had already turned towards what those groups might do in retaliation. Now, some few black people did heroically try and vote, but armed white men blocked every road in town and watched nearly every polling station, and they turned many, many away, guns in hand. Alexander Manley, the newspaper publisher and the acknowledged mixed-race descendant of the former governor I mentioned before, well, he passed through one of those roadblocks with a password and skin wide enough for passing the guards. In fact, the red shirts who let him through were even kind enough to give his group some rifles, in case Manley spotted himself outside of town, and invited them to come to the party they were planning to hold after they lynched him. The governor of North Carolina, the previously mentioned Republican Daniel Lindsay Russell, voted in his hometown of Wilmington without incident, but his train back to Raleigh was stopped at least twice by red shirts, and he had to be persuaded to hide from them in the mail baggage car. The Democrats successfully stole the election for the state legislature that year by 25,000 votes, and not just via intimidation. In Wilmington particularly, they destroyed many Republican ballots and inflated their own totals wherever possible. To give you some idea of things, as the Raleigh News and Observer reports, quote, in the 4th precinct, Democrats dramatically suppressed the black vote. Although 337 Republicans were registered in the precinct, the party tallied only 97 votes. In the 5th precinct, Democrats not only suppressed the black vote, they also inflated their own totals. 30 Democrats were registered in the precinct, but the party earned 456 votes. A precinct with 343 registered voters produced a total of 607 votes, end quote. In 2 years, the Democrats in Wilmington went from losing by 5,000 votes to winning by 6,000 votes, a wild and ridiculous swing of 11,000 votes. And yet this is not the coup I have been referring to so far, though it is the beginning of things, for when the sun rose on November the 9th, blood had not yet been shed. Waddell, I told you about before, the public face of the local conspiracy of 9 elites of society in Wilmington to seize control of the city. Well, they could not let things stand the way they were, and neither could their backers. You see, the city's mayor and aldermen and many other local officials had not been up for election. Fusionist government was still in place. So, using the already departed Alexander Manly and his already shut down newspaper as an excuse, the pro-coup forces organized a large and armed white mob and dramatically summoned about 36 prominent black citizens of the area to appear before them. Literally backed by armed men, Waddell lectured and berated and demanded and proclaimed much bullshit for effect, and demanded of the men he had assembled before them that they make their people stop voting and taking work from white people, and also demanded that Manly's paper be closed and Manly leave town, 2 things that had already happened. He told them that they had 12 hours to respond before he did anything else, but it's clear he had already made up his mind about what he would do next, whatever their response. The next morning, the 10th, an incredibly compliant and reasonable reply from the area's black people who had been forced to assemble before Waddell lay in his mailbox, which concerned him not in the slightest. That morning, Waddell led one armed group to make himself the mayor, while the rest of the mob dispersed into smaller patrols to rampage areas of the city containing a concentration of black homes and businesses. The Wilmington Light Infantry, stationed nearby and just returned from the Spanish-American War, and commanded by a brother of one of the conspirators, was authorized by Governor Russell to quell the riot. Instead, they joined it, and brought out that aforementioned expensive-as-shit modern Gatling gun to kill and intimidate, as well as a recently acquired Hotchkiss gun from the Naval Reserve. As the black minister J. Allen Kirk put it, quote, "It was a great sight to see them marching from death, and the colored women, colored men, colored children, colored enterprises, and colored people all exposed to death. Firing began, and it seemed like a mighty battle in wartime. The shrieks and screams of children, of mothers, of wives were heard, such as caused the blood of the most inhuman person to creep. Thousands of women, children, and men rushed into the swamps, and there lay upon the earth in the cold to freeze and starve. The woods were filled with colored people. The streets were dotted with their bodies. A white gentleman said that he saw 10 bodies lying in the undertaker's office at one time. Some of their bodies were left lying in the streets until up in the next day following the riot. Some were found by the stench and miasma that came forth from their decaying bodies under their houses. Every colored man who passed through the streets had either to be guarded by one of the crowd or have a paper pass giving him the right to pass. All colored men at the cotton press and oil mills were ordered not to leave their labor but stop there. while their wives and children were shrieking and crying in the midst of the flying balls and in sight of the cannons and Gatling gun. All the white people had gone out of that part of the city. This army of men marched through the streets, sword buckled to their sides, giving the command to fire. Men stood at their labor, wringing their hands and weeping, but they dared not move to the protection of their homes. And then when they passed through the streets, had to hold up their hands and be searched. The little white boys of the cities searched them and took from them every means of defense, and if they resisted, they were shot down. The city was under military rule. No Negro was allowed to come into the city without being examined or without passing through with his boss for whom he labored. Colored women were examined and their hats taken off, and search was made even under their clothing. They went from house to house looking for Negroes that they considered offensive. They took arms they had hidden and killed them for the least expression of manhood. They gathered around colored homes, firing like great sportsmen firing at rabbits in an open field, and one would jump his man from 60 to 100 shots would be turned loose upon him. His escape was impossible. One fellow was walking along a railroad and they shot him down without any provocation. It is said by an eyewitness that men lay upon the street dead and dying, while members of their race walked by helpless and unable to do them any good, or their families. Negro stores were closed, and the owners thereof driven out of the city and even shipped away at the point of a gun. Some of the churches were searched for ammunition, and cannons turned toward the door, in the attitude of blowing up the church if the pastor or officers did not open them that they might go through. End quote. Among those banished from the city were Messrs. Salem J. Bell and Robert B. Pickens, one of the area's 4 successful fish and oyster dealers that I told you about before, and many, many black men were among those driven out of town at gunpoint. It is hard to know exactly how many died. The coup was successful. Inaccurate information like that hardly of concern to the victorious, but tradition and intuition points me to hundreds of deaths. Probably not more than the 300 usually cited through oral tradition, though thousands more would flee, and almost none would ever return. It may be a little bit tedious to you, but before I move on to the coup's culmination, I want to read a little something from the People's Party Handbook that will make clear just how undemocratic everything that led up to all this was. And that victory for the Democratic Party at the ballot box was designed to give only some appearance of nonviolent legitimacy to its government. Quote, "It must not be supposed that the Democratic machine confined its election machinations to such counties as it thought it could manipulate, and did manipulate, on account of the presence of the Negro vote. Encouraged and emboldened by its success in those counties, it enlarged its field of operations, and along in 1888, 1890, and 1892, it embraced, in its plan of campaign, a considerable number of western counties, in which there is a large number of white voters who have never had the best educational advantages. These the Democratic machine classified as the illiterate white vote. And according to the idea of the machine, these white voters were there for the same purpose that the Negro vote existed in some of the eastern counties. That is, to be manipulated in the interest of what was called the Democratic Party. A few illustrations will show that the ballots of the white voters of these western counties were as successfully handled by the machine as the ballots of the Negro voters in the eastern counties. Democratic regime made Davidson County show a Democratic plurality of about 100. Under an honest election and account of the ballot as cast, this county shows an anti-democratic plurality of about 500. Democratic regime made Surrey County show a Democratic plurality of about 300. Under an honest election law, this county shows an anti-democratic plurality of about 500. Democratic regime made Watauga County show a Democratic plurality of about 100. Under an honest election law, this county shows an anti-democratic plurality of about 150. Under a Democratic regime, the county of Forsyth was made to show a Democratic plurality of about 600. Under the honest election law of 1896, this anti-democratic plurality was more than 1,100. Under Democratic regime, Buncombe County went Democratic by about 400 plurality. Under an honest election law, the same county went anti-Democratic by about 400 plurality. Democratic regime made Guilford County go Democratic by about 300. Under an honest election law, the same county went anti-Democratic in 1896 by nearly 1,000. Let it be repeated again that these figures are taken from the official records of the vote for governor in 1892 and 1896. They show conclusively that the Democratic machine fears the honesty and integrity of the ballot, that it fears the white vote as much as it professes to fear the Negro vote, and that the only way it preserved life for itself for a number of years was by stealing and falsely counting the ballots of white and colored voters alike. Living figures attest the truth of this statement. A party that cannot face an honest ballot is a party to be both feared and despised by the people. End quote. And well said, even if I sound a little bit like Dinesh D'Souza right now. The People's Party won't be around to publish any voter guides after this in North Carolina, unfortunately. But getting back to the coup and to Alfred Waddell. He waddled his way at the head of a mob to destroy the now abandoned publishing office of Manly's paper, and when they were finished with that, they set off to make him mayor by 4 o'clock on the 10th. Silas Wright was a white Republican and the mayor of Wilmington. You may read that he was black in some sources that really ought to know better. But this is because he was so frequently called the N-word as a result of his political coalition with black people, I think. He and all the city aldermen were forced to resign at gunpoint, guns held by men Waddell spoke for. George Z. French was a white populist and the acting sheriff of New Hanover County. Not only was he forced to resign, but a noose placed around his neck and efforts made to begin to string him up before one of the coup leaders pleaded for his life. He was instead bodily dragged to the train station and told to leave North Carolina forever on peril of his life. John Melton, another white populist and the chief of police of Wilmington, allegedly turned white as a sheep when a rope tied into a noose was thrown at his feet. He was out too, vanished. All that really remained after the killing and the purges, not a single white person was killed during this whole affair, by the way, was to write the histories, which Waddell was already thinking about, and he will portray himself in the press, local and national, as the reluctant leader and tempering force behind a righteous and uncontrolled popular fury, who was able to achieve public office again without intimidation, and who only employed violence to suppress riotous black people. In fact, it is from him, and this incident, that the term race riot comes, originally used exclusively as a descriptor for non-white people's violence against white people. Waddell will hold office until 1906 and die without ever facing justice in 1912. I have been thinking more and more about how to think about the role of race in American political life. I sometimes get the feeling from historians and journalists of an honest bent that there's an inescapable resignation they feel to the idea that white people just tend to separate themselves from non-white people. And the best they can do in their politics, given that they insist upon this truth, is to try and balance the interests of whites and non-whites, accepting that there are discrete black communities and discrete white communities in America, and further insisting that because white supremacy is such a potent force in American politics, this stuff can never really be overcome, except perhaps on timescales longer than the span of the human life. Or perhaps they count on that white population to just become sufficiently minority demographically. They think most white people are just too racist to form political coalitions with non-whites when they are appealed to on the basis of their race by the Republican Party. And before they can join any left political coalitions, they need education. More and more, I am suspicious of all of that. I am pro-racial education, of course, and fiercely proclaim that all white people should read the history honestly, and with their hearts ever centered on the universal truth that within all of us there exists every person who has ever existed or will ever exist. To do so does help to expose white supremacy as a lie, and a dangerous lie to all. Have I not just detailed how the corrupt and elite interests of capital consciously chose white supremacy, to campaign on, when they were really far more interested in extracting ever more profit from their place in the economy? But things don't have to be that way. The white populists, fusionists, and Republicans of North Carolina were all racist as hell. And they believed it simply obvious that people with white skin are better than people without it. But because they didn't organize their political demands around that belief, they were nonetheless able to achieve power and began real democratic reforms to make not just their lives, but everyone's lives better. And they were already creeping toward a realization that black people are equal in some very important ways to white ones after only a few years. And all of this happened within the old Confederacy itself. Doubtless, if this trend had continued in politics, it would have been messy and imperfect and racist. But over time, it is hard to see how those white people wouldn't grow less racist as they began to build something together with other people. What's more, however natural this human tendency to divide ourselves and to separate ourselves into discrete racial groups and organize our politics around that fact, that sort of thing's not strong enough to sustain itself. I've said it before, but it bears repeating. This is well after the Civil War, well after the end of Reconstruction, and a generation passed under the rule of the racist and right-wing elite of North Carolina. And in some cases under the rule of the very same men who had really ruled the Confederacy. And they had already conquered the state's politics completely and ruled it as they wished under the banner of white supremacy and the good old lost cause. They governed, in the end, for the white elite alone, and they never had any intention of representing anyone else, whatever their race. And so they ran the state and its people into the ground. And they did nothing but save whatever they could for themselves in the face of economic collapse and debt crisis. And because they sucked so bad, they were destined to be so unpopular, they were overthrown, and their ideas about how to govern exposed as a load of horseshit. In order for those racist reactionaries to reobtain power, it wasn't enough to simply wait for natural white supremacy to reemerge as the dominant organizing principle in politics. That would never work. Such ideas require a lot of help. During my research for this episode, I read the analogy a lot that the Democrats say fanned the flames of white supremacy, or planted their hate on fertile soil to achieve victory. I actually really don't like this way of talking about it, because it sells the efforts of these racists short. We are talking about recruiting, organizing, equipping, and paying thousands of men in 1898 under arms, and about organizing a secret conspiracy to murder and overthrow the government. Rather than fanning a flame, it is more like they gathered tinder, wood, and kerosene beforehand. They did not stumble onto a smoldering fire and make of it what they could. They saw a way to create a conflagration out of the material they could assemble at hand. They had to. White supremacy is not so strong and unconquerable by itself. Race that is socially constructed, and it persists throughout time, but it also requires constant renewal and encouragement to dominate politics. Most people, most of the time, I think, are too good not to see through the con given enough time, even if they themselves are products of the same white supremacist society. Finally, I know in America it is election time, and I did not choose this material accidentally. I have been thinking a lot about what incidents or people from history are most useful to examine in order to try and understand America, November 2020. People fear what's usually just colloquially referred to as a civil war. But a civil war, to me, generally refers to the idea of separate states or governments ceasing to recognize other states or parts of government's authority and then fighting things out. I'm not so sure we're on that path, but in some cities, I think, something like Wilmington actually is possible. It's an open secret that the cops don't really work for the mayor or the council in most places, and in some cases don't even really work for the police chief. They know they can do as they please, and also not do as they please. If they are ordered to arrest those they do not want to, or not to arrest those they do want to, they are likely in both cases to do as they will, and face no repercussion. I can easily imagine a city or local level official being deposed from office under those conditions if they actually did try and boss the cops around and not take no for an answer. But in other ways, Wilmington is much different than today, and not just because the Democrats in office, I fear, will never be up to try to boss those cops around. But for another, there's far less need for a large militia or paramilitary group in service of white supremacy, for we have cops themselves to do that today in most places most of the time, and they're already doing the work that red shirts might do. Now don't misunderstand me, we do have such groups like militias that are a threat maybe that should be considered seriously, but they're not that big. And it's really civilian law enforcement that's the muscle here in our right-wing politics, not militias or paramilitaries. In one way, we actually lag behind the fusionist politics that dominated North Carolina and Wilmington for a few years. Local offices then had real power in some ways. Rather than seek to limit the ability for non-whites to vote and serve in public office today, the United States tends to draw lines in ways that limit that sort of influence as much as possible, and then further limit the power to do anything at a local level that might result in upsetting the current balance of power. In other words, the more winnable an office is for the left, the less consequential that office's powers tend to be, I'd say. But we can still find a way, I think, and it isn't too late. Most people would agree that your average white person today in America is less racist than your average white person in 1890s North Carolina, surely? There was so much they didn't know about race, so much that they thought they knew that they really didn't, and yet, those white people formed a political coalition with those black people that transcended all of it. And not one that eked out a narrow victory, but one which blew the conservative coalition to smithereens, however briefly. We could do the same today, perhaps, as humans, and we needn't wait for that far-off day when every white person is no longer too racist to do it. I'll tell you what I think is truth, and it's a truth that the populists and fusionists and Republicans of the time all held dear. It's a truth that people like Oliver Dockery, who I mentioned before and quoted earlier. You may abuse me if you like, but I want to tell you that you will never make a duck wet by pouring water on it. The man who would steal a man's vote would steal a man's pig, given the opportunity. And from the ranks of democracy will come every mother's son, the many thousands who are righteous in wrath against these conspirators masquerading for democracy. Even now, today, violent conspirators are masquerading as peaceful voters, and have already begun to determine whose votes they will consider legitimate. The danger for us today is not that the fascists will march into City Hall at the head of a massive mob. Times are different for us, and the American people more atomized and socially isolated than ever, for one thing. On the other hand, humanity's level of technological advancement means it really only takes a small number of organized people to do some real harm, and the idea that some votes should count and others not, unchanged from 1898. It becomes plainer to me every day that whatever the results of our election in 2020, those who want blood won't be stopped by the ballot. Because it's whose ballot that should count and who representational government is for that is among their greatest concerns then and now. Whether their answer to that question is popular enough to win a fair election is far less important to them. than the answer itself. Their so-called democracy is for white people with money. It's no wonder they aren't interested in pointlessly debating that question with those who aren't rich and white already, or with whites they would call race traitors. Because the most important thing that's the same for us as it was in 1898 is that their enthusiasm for white identities is indulged, their violent enthusiasm encouraged, and their disgusting and incoherent philosophies ultimately created by the interests of concentrated capital, who want nothing so much as to keep the public sphere subservient to capital's interest, and those who work for a living forcefully under its rule. And if elections result in challenging that, there is always work bloodier than campaigning that can be done. Thank you for listening. I hope that you enjoyed that. It was all over the place, and yet I still feel like I left out a lot, and I'm already at an hour. So, what did you think? You can let me know on Twitter. My handle is @JeffSDudeness. I'm in my Discord. If you want access to that, you go patreon.com/DistantPeasant. Sorry if I got a little bit dark at the end. I really didn't intend to. And I wish I had more practical advice to give. I don't. But I do smell blood in the air. Unfortunately. I don't relish it. And I think no matter what the results of 2020, things are going to be dicey for the United States and its institutions because they are losing legitimacy rapidly among people. Just as they kind of did in 1898. So, I think you know what I'm getting at. I hope you know what I'm getting at. If you don't, then you can tell me all about it. Again, that's on Twitter @JeffSDudeness, patreon.com/DistantPeasant. Get on the Discord. Check out my Twitch TV. Twitch.tv/postrevolution. See you next time.